Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Michelle Cassandra Johnson, who's here to share with us her new book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. So did you know that we hold grief in our bodies and collectively? Michelle teaches that in order to respond to grief that we experience as a collective, we need to be present to what is breaking our hearts. So, Michelle Cassandra Johnson is a social justice warrior, author, dismantling racism trainer, empath, yoga teacher and practitioner, and an intuitive healer. With over 20 years of experience leading dismantling racism work and working with clients as a licensed clinical social worker, she has a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the body, mind, spirit, and heart. She has led dismantling racism trainings with large corporations, small nonprofits, and community groups, including Duke University, Google, This Is America Life, and many more. So let's welcome to the show, Michelle Cassandra Johnson.
Thank you so much for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your book, Finding Refuge. I found it to be so profound. Why did you decide that now was the time to write this book?
Yes, I love this question because the idea for Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief, came to me. It was in late 2019, and then I started to write a book proposal and ended up working with Shambhala Publications to publish this. And I began writing it in 2020 before I and many of us understood COVID-19 was here and the impact that it would have on us. And so it was interesting to write this book in the backdrop of COVID-19 and the many other pandemics and the global uprising in response to the murder of George Floyd. Like that was the backdrop for which I wrote this book. And it's interesting to write about collective grief and trauma as collective grief and trauma are playing out in ways that I had never experienced. I had never lived through a health pandemic, and Finding Refuge is not about COVID, although I'm just naming this because that was what was unfolding as I was writing about cultural trauma and a shift in consciousness based on an experience that changes how we think of who we are as a collective. The other reason why I would say I wrote this book is the first chapter is about my mother, and she was sick in 2019 and 2020. She almost died. She had a terrible infection and spinal stenosis, and she had an infection in her lumbar spine that actually came from her legs and a chronic condition she has. And so the first chapter is about her and navigating the healthcare system and my relationship with my mother, and also navigating a system that really didn't regard her as sacred or precious. And I'm not talking about individual healthcare providers. I'm more talking about how systems can operate when they're not centering relationship in humans and when they are under-resourced. And of course, during COVID, like the healthcare workers and system experienced this pandemic in a way it had never experienced, and again was under-resourced. So I also wrote this, I believe, to honor my mother, and not just her, but the other people navigating systems that we're not necessarily seeing them as human, as sacred, as precious, and all the ways in which we might have to correspond or interact with systems that don't humanize us. So that's the other piece of this. And finally, what I'll name is Finding Refuge is about spiritual practice. And it is about how spiritual practice can help us respond to collective trauma and grief. Of course, also our individual experiences of grief and loss. And so it's a resource that calls us into thinking about how practice can ground and anchor us, and how we need a practice just to be a human alive on the planet right now, that we need a practice to help us stay rooted and grounded. And so there are many practices infused throughout Finding Refuge to invite people into what that practice might look like for them, given that we are all going to experience grief and loss and likely have. And so those are some of the reasons why I ended up writing Finding Refuge.
So when we talk about collective grief, for our listeners that might be new to that, what does that mean?
Yes, a great question. So many people might relate to grief in response to a loss they've experienced in their lives. So the loss of a family member, the loss of a relationship, a big transition, a move, a job change, something very unexpected, or something one may have anticipated, anticipatory grief and loss. And so often people can access this concept of collective grief through their understanding of individual loss and their experience of making space to grieve or not grieve, because Finding Refuge also speaks to what gets in the way of us grieving and how, in fact, many institutions have made it difficult for us to acknowledge our grief. And some of this is based on there's a time limit, right? We get 3 to 5 days to grieve in response to a loss, when we understand it actually takes much longer and grief is ongoing and our relationship to loss is ongoing. So that's the first piece for people to think about, the losses they've experienced, and then to think about collectively, what are we losing? Often people move through and they have experiences and they feel like they're the only one having that experience. And in fact, usually that's not true, that we're not experiencing grief and loss in isolation. And I sat in meditation and contemplation about Finding Refuge and this idea of collective grief, because I thought about the programs and therapies and different modalities that are available to some of us, right? It depends on our resources, but available to us to move through individual grief, that actually don't acknowledge how systems create grief for us, right? Or the shared experience of grief and loss that we have. Of course, now we have experienced a global pandemic, and so people actually have another access point for collective grief. We all went through something that was unexpected, that created a level of uncertainty that I would imagine many of us had never experienced before. There was a shock to the system, the nervous system, and every other part of the system, and not just for me, Michelle, but for us all. And this changed how we think of who we are. COVID-19 changed how we related. It interrupted things. And it also invited us, I feel, in so many ways, to ask ourselves how we want to be in relationship with one another and this precious planet we get to inhabit. And so collective grief and collective trauma really speak to that interruption, that shock to the nervous system on a collective scale, right? So everyone in your family, everyone in your neighborhood, everyone in your community, everyone in your state, we all experienced a great amount of loss in response to COVID-19. And there are many other ways we've experienced loss. And some of this depends on our identities and the systems we're responding to, systems of oppression we're responding to. But I find that people can relate to this because now we've had this experience where 4.5 billion people have died, right? Like it's across the globe. And so never had I experienced anything like that before. And it calls us into this. For me, I feel like there's a moment for us to pause and think about, how do we recover? And how do we come into space together with one another to acknowledge what we've moved through? And how do we mourn and grieve? And of course, this also feels connected to the ways in which people were not able to grieve in response to losing loved ones, right? Like I'm almost 48. I had never experienced people transitioning, passing away in the hospital, and like saying goodbye on through FaceTime, right? Or not being able to move through rituals like a funeral in person, but doing it on Zoom. These are things I just never thought I would experience in my life. And yet many of us have moved through these experiences. So I would invite people to think about their own individual experiences of grief and loss, to scale that to the collective. And then we have this experience we've all moved through that points to the collective losses we've experienced and what we might need to do to heal. And, when I say heal, I mean acknowledge what has happened. And so that's a little bit about collective grief and cultural trauma, which is, when we move through an experience and it changes our consciousness such that we have to reconfigure who we are.
It seems that we're going through many experiences of collective grief. I mean, we have Of course, there was the pandemic. We have people dying of opioid overdoses in alarming numbers. There are more suicides happening than there ever have been. And so there are all these different forms that we are really being, like we're just being faced with. We can't not look at them anymore, not look at what's happening to us collectively. And I find it so fascinating because your book, it does go through that and in some ways beyond. It's something that where people are suffering from one form or another of grief, they can really gain some gems in your book to help them through that.
Yeah, I mean, that's my hope, right? That this is why Finding Refuge has so many practices and so many personal narratives that are then scaled to the collective. And there's an invitation for people to reflect on, how can I relate to a loved one navigating the healthcare system, or how can I relate to what's happening to the climate, right? And the ways in which relationships are fractured, or how can I relate to losing a friend, which there's a chapter about my friend Eric in Finding Refuge, but really it's about being an empath and having an enlarged heart and what it means to elevate our consciousness and connect to our hearts such that we can show up in a different way for one another. So I appreciate what you said about the beyond piece of that. There's this deep acknowledgement of grief and all of the ways we're experiencing it that you just named, right? And then there's, okay, here are some practices. If we're going to be moving through this human experience in this way, as I named before, we need practices. What do these look like? And we need to be conscious of our hearts, right? We need to be connected to them, which is part of the reason the subtitle is heart work, right? This is heart work. It is challenging work. It's difficult. It's also heart work. And it's getting into the heart in service of, I would say, the collective.
I really appreciate your, you do have a practice in there called being present with my heart. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that for our listeners and what that really kind of entails and helps us with.
Yeah, this is the practice that is at the end of chapter 1, the chapter about my mother, Clara. And this practice emerged from my own connection with my heart, but also the experience I was having with my mom when she was sick. And what my spiritual practice, I believe, equipped me to do, which was to be present with her. We thought she was going to transition. She did not at that time, but everyone thought that was what was happening, including her. She kept saying she was talking to the ancestors. She'd stopped eating. She'd stopped drinking. She was preparing to transition and sort of in a liminal space and wasn't lucid most of the time. And I remember sitting with her and breathing and being present to what she was moving through. And then my relationship as her daughter, right? My relationship with her, but also as her, the primary caregiver, in the sense I was making medical decisions at that point. And so it was very personal in that sense of being with her and thinking about the heart work that needed to happen to make decisions so that she could suffer less, right? That was the place I was in. And that feels like heart work because it feels deeply compassionate to think about, what does this person or what does this group of people, what might they need to suffer less, and how can we mitigate suffering? Of course, not knowing, because she couldn't tell me what she wanted. So the being present with my heart practice came from that. It also came from how sensitive I am about what is happening on the planet and all of the things you named. And this call for us to come back into our hearts and really to our heartbreak. All the different things that might be causing heartbreak, because I find that in so many ways we are, and I'm going to generalize, encouraged not to connect to our hearts and our heartbreak, because that can be a really scary place, right? Or not connect with our grief and what we've lost. And instead sort of think about the heart in some other way, as if it's not this like passageway and portal for feeling all of the things, which is how I experience it. And so being present with my heart is this invitation to get into the heart, both the ways in which the heart opens and also the heartbreak that might reside, right? In the heart, in the body, in the psyche, in the spirit. And this practice invites people to think about and consider what they're holding in their hearts. It invites people to bring their awareness to their breath. it invites people to connect with the overwhelm of this time, to lean into it, to go into it. And I would say the practice in itself is a container. It's not go into the overwhelm and become even more overwhelmed. It is just an invitation to turn toward what is present, what I understand to be present. And if we are awake and alive and feeling into what's going on, right, what is present, part of that is heartbreak. And then there are some journaling prompts focused on what one might be holding in their heart at this time and how it's affecting them on all these different levels and in all these different ways. And then there's a mantra or affirmation that is, I feel my heart, I acknowledge my heart, I feel my heartbeat, I acknowledge my heartbeat. And I taught this practice. I've taught it many times, but I was in New Orleans teaching it as part of an immersion at a yoga studio there. And one of the people in the immersion said, I'm used to connecting with my heart in this way. Like, I feel my heart, I have a heart. But the thing that got them is I acknowledge my heart and I feel my heart beat. And they were like, oh, I've never really thought about it this way. I really feel my heart in my body, which means I feel all of the things. And I feel my heart beat, right? The pulse, this awareness that I'm alive, right? The wakefulness to our aliveness. And it really struck me when they talked about it. So there's a mantra, and mantras and affirmations can be very grounding for people. Like, oh, I have a heart. I feel my heart. I'm here present with my heart. I feel my heartbeat. I'm presencing myself to my heartbeat. I'm presencing myself to all that is moving through my heart at this time. So that's a little bit about the practice.
Well, I was really touched. There's a sentence in your book that I think, if we come from this perspective, would help so much. But you talk about how your spiritual practice allow you to sit with your heartbreak and open heart enough where you can hold on to your mother, but not need her to stay in the physical body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is so. Our conversation is quite timely because about a month ago, my mother went back into the hospital, and she's been in twice in the last month. She's at home now. But of course, Finding Refuge and all of the practices have been very present with me and coming back to me. And everything I wrote in chapter 1 about my mom is coming back to me. And just what you named about our capacity, right? How we build capacity through practice and a connection with the heart. In the way, and that's just how it happened for me, where I could, as you just said, be with what was happening. I thought I was going to lose my mother, and so did everyone else, right? And to, instead of deny that or turn away from it, to be present to that, and then to be present to her, because I wanted to be with her, right? I didn't want her to be alone in that. I'm not aware that she knew what was going on. I'm not sure, but I didn't want to leave her in that. I just wanted to be present with her, which practice is what saved me in that moment. I mean, it's what allowed me to be like, Michelle, you're having this experience and your mother's having this experience, and you want to hold her hand and you would like to be with her through this. And the only way to do it is to be with your heart and acknowledge all that's going on and to be with her heart. And that's so much of what occurred through that experience and process. And she, in fact, she also, this most recent time when she was in the hospital, she looked at me. I was getting ready. I'd been there for hours and I was getting ready to just leave for a few moments to get a meal. And she said, "You are my heart, Michelle. You're my heart." And I said, "You're my heart too." And I thought about Finding Refuge and what you just named. I know I'm my mom's heart, but she had never said it to me in that way. And so there was an acknowledgement, like, when someone looks at you and you're like, oh, they see me, they know me. It was that kind of feeling when she said, "You're my heart, Michelle." So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that sentence and this awareness of practice and the power of it to build capacity in our hearts, to be open-hearted and broken-hearted at the same time.
Well, I'm so sorry to hear that your mom has been going through that, and I'm glad to hear that she's back home. But I understand, because it seems a lot of times when we have loved ones that are in the hospital, sometimes our wants and desires to have them stay and not transition, I don't know if some ways can hold them back, but they definitely may be holding us back.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. I appreciate you naming that, because I do think I'm not suggesting it's easy to let go. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why we suffer as humans. It's hard to let go, right? And we don't know what it's going to be like. And it's deeply heartbreaking when we lose people we love, or the relationship changes in some way. And yet we're going to go at some point, and the people we love are. And so I accept that reality. I'm not saying I'm going to have an easy time when my mother transitions. I'm just naming, like, practice has taught me that. I'm very clear that we are going to lose, right, what we have. And I will not be in this body forever, nor will the people I love, right, and in their bodies. And so I think practice has just deepened my acceptance of this reality, which allowed me to be like, she doesn't want a feeding tube, right? She didn't want that. I just intuited that, and then later asked her when she was lucid, and she didn't want a feeding tube, right? She didn't want to stay in this. She was kind of in a liminal space, as I said, an in-between space at certain points. And she was sending clear signals that she was ready, even though she ended up staying, right? And I'm grateful to have more time with her, for sure. But I do think you're right. We can hold people back, that can hold us back, and that resistance to accepting loss, or the resistance to letting go, in so many ways can hold us back. And I think letting go at times, as difficult as it is, can open up. The process of letting go is a portal in itself, right? This experience of letting go, of releasing, of not gripping, I find that's a portal and an opening. So yes, it's difficult. And I think spiritual practice in particular, is what can support us in deepening the skill of letting go and of acceptance.
Well, thank you for sharing on that. I feel like this discussion and the work that you do will help a lot of people when we come to that threshold, really sit with a practice that will help them through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's my hope with Finding Refuge. And that the resources are resources and practices people can come back to time and time again.
So can you explain your relationship with your intuition? Because I know you're highly intuitive.
Yes. The chapter about intuition and finding refuge is about my friend Eric, who transitioned very unexpectedly. And he was a dear beloved and friend. And when I started writing the chapter about Eric, I didn't actually understand how much it would be about intuition and what he taught me about that. And again, the heart work and being present with the heart. Since I was a little girl, I have, I'm going to back up. I'm going to say, I actually think each one of us is intuitive. And I think part of what happens is that through systems and through maybe cultural norms or family norms, even, we're sort of taught, we can be taught to conform. We can be taught not to listen to our inner knowing, and instead to listen to others to take direction. Now, I can listen to others and take direction, but what I mean is that children are often they're more imaginative than adults are, and typically adults have to go through a process of learning how to imagine or reimagine again. And I think children naturally have a connection to their inner knowing and listening. Of course, this depends on their environment and family and all the conditions in place, but I just believe children come in with more connection to intuition, and then many things can disrupt that, where we doubt ourselves. Certainly trauma and experiences where there's a lot of self-doubt, or whatever we internalize about who we are, the messages that we internalize from dominant systems and systems of superiority, can make us feel less than and unworthy, so that we don't trust ourselves. Or we move through experiences where there are periods of time where we lack that trust and connection. And spiritual practice, for me, has really reconnected me, I'll say, with my intuition. Although when I was a child, I do think I had a deep knowing of intuition, and a deep knowing that I was an empath for sure. I still am, although I work with it in a different way, because being an empath can feel overwhelming at times. And as a child, I was asking questions, right? Very inquisitive and curious about people's experiences and different experiences we were having. And this felt connected to intuition for me, this curiosity and this like seeking, right? I wanted to understand why certain things happened. I wanted to understand why I was feeling certain emotions, right? I wanted to understand why people were reacting. I understood I had an inner voice. I wanted to understand why at times that couldn't be expressed or I wasn't listened to. And I think all of this allowed me to deepen into intuition. And then, of course, being introduced to spiritual practice, in particular yoga, which feels like a practice that invites one and has invited me to listen to myself more deeply and to listen and observe what's happening around me, right? That really built my connection with my intuition even more, and affirmed that there is this inner knowing, this vision, this force or energy that moves through me, right? That can't be taken away or disrupted or interrupted anymore. And since, in my adulthood, I have, in addition to yoga and spiritual practice, studied with different teachers to learn more about skills to deepen intuition and pay attention to different signs and symbols, and things people might say that where they're not speaking to me, but actually it is for me. The message they're sharing is for me. And I pay so much attention to synchronicities as well now. And all of this feels connected to intuition. And in this chapter about Eric, which I mentioned is about the heart and intuition. It is about how the heart and our connection to the heart allows us to connect more deeply with intuition. And that in fact, the heart is deeply intuitive, but the mind can get in the way of the heart. Our conditioning can get in the way of what the heart knows or what we know in our gut or what we know, if you follow the chakra system, what we know through the third eye, that space between the eyebrows, this vision and inner knowing. And so again, this chapter is a call to work with the heart such that we're able to listen again. And my belief is that if we tune into our intuition, it's not just in service of an individual, right? There's a way that we actually connect or begin to remember our interconnectedness, which I talk a lot about in my work. And we're able to build those empathetic skills, right, through this awareness of our interconnectedness. And we're able to listen to one another, and we're able to make space for different perspectives and experiences. And so again, it's not because I want to like connect all the synchronicities, right? It's that I'm in connection with all beings, and my intuition allows me actually to be a better human and listen, right? A better human on the planet, and to other humans and other beings, non-humans. That intuition allows me to be guided in a way that my conditioning or what I've internalized or the mind stuff actually can get in the way. And so it's for more clarity too, our intuition, connecting to it. And, in yoga, when we are able to see clearly, and one of the reasons why we suffer is because it's talked about as not having clear sight, which you can think about this as not understanding what is truly happening and going on. But if we work on this clear sight, right, that will call us into, this is how it's talked about in yoga philosophy, that memory of our interconnectedness and that we are one. So intuition feels connected to that as well.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Michelle Cassandra Johnson in regards to her new book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
In your hands lie ancestral patterns. These patterns shape how you think, what you struggle with, and experiences you love, your life pattern. We're going into the latest neuroscience of biological hand analysis, a realm beyond palmistry where science and the soul entwine. Hand analysis is the latest method to transform lifelong patterns. I am Master Hand Analyst Brent Bruning. Join us and visit thepowerinyourhands.com.
Looking for a page turner? Cozy up to a fantasy adventure romance trilogy with The Girl in the Toile Wallpaper by Mary Kay Savarese. The second novel in the Star Writers trilogy, The Star Writers Club, is coming soon. Take the journey. Connect with Mary at www.maryksavarese.com. Her books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores.
With Breath Hub, you'll experience the transformative power of breath as it harmonizes your body, mind, and spirit. Recommended by experts in fitness, sports, psychology, and medicine. Meet the scientific way of being well. Breath Hub. Breathe better, live better.
The book Terminal Cancer is a Misdiagnosis, authored by Danny Carroll, is on sale at Amazon now. Licensed psychologist and psychotherapist Tessa Antia-John-Guerra commented, "This is one of the most empowering books on the topic of cancer you will ever read." Award-winning author T.L. Needham commented, "This recommended book can be understood by anyone seeking answers, hope, and alternatives to a terminal diagnosis. Buy it now on Amazon.com.
Pandemonium. Fast forward 20 years. A U.S. president seizes control of all U.S. missiles, the power grid, the banking system, and every computer in America as he hides in an underground bunker. Pandemonium, a captivating sci-fi thriller where a hidden war, psychics, aliens, artificial intelligence, and transcendental love collide with the latest media technology. Pandemonium, live to all devices. Get your copy on paperback or digital. Free sample at getpsychic.org.
I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our special guest, Michelle Cassandra Johnson, who's here sharing with us her new book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. In your book, you talk about having a spiritual practice, whether it be movement, meditation, prayer, but it's a withdrawing of the senses to go inward and remember our connection to spirit. What a powerful and profound way to step into our own everyday and to have that deep connection.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and through that, right, if I'm able to, and many spiritual practices talk about this turning inward, right, and this coming back to oneself, coming home to oneself. So many people talk about this and write about this and work with this. And it's not to isolate, it's more to go back in. I mean, the world is noisy. Let's just be clear, like the world is noisy in all the ways. So to go back in, to have a practice that allows us to come back to the truth of who we are. And in the way you just shared, to connect with spirit, which means that we are then connecting. Sometimes I talk about it as spirit, sometimes as divinity, to the divinity within self, right? How sacred we are, but also the divinity held within every being and all that has been, is now, and will be. That's the benefit of turning inward, of going inside, of getting quiet, of listening, right? Of remembering we come from spirit source, however people want to think about that which is bigger than them, and that which is connected to all beings. So practice has certainly done this for me. It's one of the greatest gifts of the practice is to remember the expanse of who I am, as I remember I am connected to spirit.
In your book, you share about moving into wholeness, and I'd love for you to share with our listeners what that is.
I'm just laughing because I'm chuckling a little because that people can read the book, but that chapter, there was so much going on in my life. I will say that. It's chapter 3 in the book, and there was so much happening. So much grief and loss and change and transition, almost just too much at the same time, like too much for my body, it felt like. And the chapter became about wholeness because so much I felt fractured in many ways because of the disruptions that were occurring in my life at the time, and had to really contemplate, what does it mean to come back to myself, right? What does it mean to honor my wholeness when I am moving through a system, an organization at the time that is not actually holding that for me? What does it mean to reclaim wholeness? So that's the essence of this chapter, the theme in the chapter, and how that reclamation of wholeness, how I was clear I had to do that for myself and through practice, that wasn't going to happen in the environment I was in. It just, the conditions weren't in place for that to happen. And so when I think about coming back into wholeness, and I talk about this so much in my work, I think a lot about, as I've named, coming home to myself, remembering to remember who I am, not letting a system or an organization break me apart or further fracture me, not allowing the experience of cultural trauma to overwhelm me so much so that I forget, right? I'm connected to spirit, I'm connected to you, I'm connected to everyone. And this chapter about wholeness, because in it I talk about my father transitioning, which he did in July of 2017. And it's sort of the basis for this chapter, because I was faced with like grieving, and I was living in a new place, and I'd moved all the way across the country, and I was getting divorced, and I was doing I closed a private practice, a social work practice. And I was doing all of these things, and then moved, and that happened. My father transitions, which I just wasn't expecting at the time. And this chapter is about how, and then I had to go to work, right? And then I had to act as if things were okay. And again, the conditions just weren't in place to support me, and I would say others, in moving through the magnitude of what was happening at the time, not only in my life, but on the planet. At the same time, when I moved across the country, I moved to Portland, Oregon for that year. We had this major heat wave happen, and then wildfires, and ash was falling from the sky. And I remember thinking, this is apocalyptic. Like, what is going on here? Right. And so there was the global, what's happening in our world, and yes, what's happening in my life. And what does it mean to come back to who I am? And ultimately, for me at that time, it meant moving back to North Carolina. It meant moving through that reclamation process, around, okay, I'm going to come back to myself, and I'm going to think about what collective care might look like, and what care for myself might look like at this time. And I also feel like coming back into wholeness, I don't think we're broken. I don't really talk about people that way, although I do think systems try to break us, and cultural conditioning tries to break us, and the ways in which we're asked to go along to get along and uphold systems that cause harm. These things break us, right? They are part of what fractures us. And so through coming back into wholeness, there has to be an acknowledgement of how these different systems try to break us. And then a question around, what do we want to do in response to that? And that might be that process of reclamation, or sovereignty, right? Or connection, or engaging in a practice to come back into wholeness. And at the end of this chapter, there is a mantra offered, which is, I am whole, I am healing, we are whole, we are healing. And it's an acknowledgement that while I was moving through all of those things individually, so many things were happening for so many people, right? So we're in connection. And while at times we may feel like we're broken, even though that's not how I regard people, that we are in a process of healing, that we are in fact whole. And it's, as I mentioned at the beginning of my response to this question, that it's really this practice of remembering we are whole, and engaging in a healing process, right, to help us remember our wholeness.
I think that's so empowering. I think a lot of times when people go through just extreme stages of grief, and there's so much that happens at once, and it seems to happen that way, that they can feel really alone. And a lot of times maybe they feel like, even God's not listening to me, or this, or spirit, or universe, however they want to do it, but they feel alone.
And I think, I wonder, I think I'm curious if it's human to be like, I'm alone in this. And I also think there are systems that make us feel alone or that isolate us, right? That I think both are happening for people. And sometimes people are alone in the sense that they don't have a network or resources, right? Or people to show up and support them as they're moving through. So that feels true as well. And what I know from having been a therapist for a long time is that we're actually never alone. And the amount of times clients would come in and say, I feel like I'm the only one. And I'm like, nope, I've seen 4 other people today who said the same thing about feeling unworthy, right? It's that we're not alone, right? Or I've seen 3 other people who are moving through grief that is similar. It's complex, but it's similar in nature to how you're feeling. Right. And I just think there's part of something happens for us in our psyche where we feel alone, and that can lead to more isolation when in fact we're not alone in this. Many people are experiencing loss and moving through grief. And that's part of finding refuge again, is this like, and how is it happening? And let's acknowledge it. And what is moving through your heart? That's why, again, there's a call to be with the heart.
It seems to be I thank goodness, a theme within your book that I think a lot of people can really resonate with. And it was one that I really appreciate. I thought your book was just written so well, such a compelling read. And when you talk about your spiritual practice within the book, when we look at spiritual practice, we could take it from a standpoint where it doesn't have to mean that you have to be one religion or another. It's really a practice, a personal practice, right?
Yes. And while I spoke about yoga earlier as my primary spiritual practice, I do feel like in Finding Refuge, there are many opportunities for people to think about what practice means to them. The invitation is just like, have a practice, right? Create a practice, come back to a practice. Let it bring you back into wholeness, right? Be consistent with your practice, and that there are many ways to practice. So I feel like it's not one way. And in fact, at the end of chapter 2, there's an invitation to move through a sadhana, which is a 40-day practice, and people to decide what that is. For some people, and people have written me, that's been, I'm going to rest every, 20 minutes every day. I'm going to rest for 40 days, right? This is going to happen. Or I'm going to move through my morning pages and write as my practice, or I'm going to meditate for 10 minutes in the morning, every morning, or I'm going to go out and commune with nature. I'm going to sit with my ancestor altar, right? Like people have done all different things, or I'm going to pray, or I'm going to move in my body with intention, or I'm going to sit in silence. So practice is personal in the way you named, and Finding Refuge, I believe, invites people to think about what that will look like for them. And there are so many different practices based on what people might be moving through, right? So maybe it is a mantra one day, maybe it is journaling, right? Maybe it is moving through the practice focused on intuition and protecting our energy. So it's by design in the way you described in this book for people to just contemplate practice and to come up with one that resonates and to adapt it as they need.
Does a spiritual practice really ground us when maybe nothing else will?
Yes. I talk about it in this way all the time, that spiritual practice holds that which I do not believe I can, right? Like that it's this vast container. And I don't even know if it can be contained in my experience, right? It's so expansive. And in yoga, and actually many traditions, there is what is called a niyama. In yoga, there are 8 limbs. There's an 8-limb path. There are other lineages and paths of yoga, but an 8-limb path is the path that I studied. And one of the limbs is the niyamas, and the niyamas are more about how we observances for self. And the 5th one is Ishvara Pranadhana, and Ishvara Pranadhana is surrender to spirit. or however people think of it. And often I think about spiritual practice as this. And Ishvara is what you pray to, what you make offerings to. It can be there's a tulip poplar right outside of my house. It could be that tree, right? It could be a river. It could be a specific deity or God that you work with. It could be a plant, right? Your Ishvara. But this particular niyama is surrender, right? Lay at the feet of, offer. And there's an acknowledgement in Ishvara Pranadhana, in my experience, of there's something bigger than you that you surrender to or you release to. And I think about practice this way. That's why I said it can hold that, which I do not believe I can, because it's bigger than me. Practice is bigger than me. And I would say it's wiser. And for me, I say this because it's connected to spirit for me. This may not be true for everyone. And so for me, because it's connected to spirit, it's just wiser. It knows more, right? It understands uncertainty in the things I cannot see, the things I do not yet know and may never know. And I love this about practice, the expansive nature of it, because the human body is not as expansive as practice, and practice is connected to spirit, right? But these things are much bigger than us. So it feels like a relief at times for me to think about practice as bigger than me, right? A place I can go to, a place that calls me back to myself.
In your book, you talk about really connecting with the ancestors, and I'd love for you to share about that with us. Because I think for some people, they're not even sure how to start doing that, or maybe they don't know who their ancestors are.
Yes. This chapter is about my grandmother, Dorothy, who I talk about a lot, and she has inspired so many things. She transitioned in 2017 as well. And I happened to be with her in this very auspicious way, be with her, didn't expect to be with her. And this chapter, as you named, is about both what we're being called into and being of service. And it is also about a connection with ancestors, which I understand working with ancestors can be challenging, difficult, confusing, liberating, all of the different experiences. And that at times, as you said, people don't know their ancestors. And what I'll say about my own ancestry is that I don't know much about it. I know a little about my lineage, but I can only trace back so far. And something I've learned about ancestry is that, one, when we want to begin to work with ancestors, we can think about ancestors broadly. We can think about ancestors in our blood lineage. We can think beyond our blood lineage. We can think about teachers we've had, teachings, art, poetry, music, the natural world, experiences, right? There are these people who've inspired us, or beings who've inspired us, who are not connected and are part of our bloodline. So I would encourage people to think about ancestry broadly. That's the first thing. The other thing is that when we want to work with ancestors or build a relationship with ancestors, I do not believe we have to know all of the ancestors. And I do believe that we want to call in the healthy and well ancestors. And people have different ways of talking about this. The way I learned is to call in the healthy and well ancestors, because we want the ancestors who are ready to support us in our own healing. And as we do our healing work, I do believe we can offer support to those ancestors who may not be healthy and well, or sort of on that journey of health and wellness. So often I call in the healthy and well ancestors. Known to me and unknown is so often what I say. I also feel like there are two other pieces about ancestors that I'll share. Time and time again, I'm reminded that ancestors who are healthy and well want to support me. This is my grandmother, Dorothy, who wants to support me, but there are many other ancestors who are healthy and well that show up. And the way I know this is because I believe I am held. I have more evidence that I'm held than not. I have more evidence that I'm cared for and that I am being guided than not, right? So there's all of this evidence and experiences and synchronicities I can point to, because I think I have a relationship to intuition and my ancestors, but they've also just shown me, right? And they're definitely part of intuition because I know I've learned how to listen to my grandmother, right? When she, from the ancestral realm, communicates something with me, for example, through a dream, or I feel her around me, right? Where she's directing me in some way. And this has come through an awareness that the healthy and well ancestors want to help me, and I'm open to them supporting me. And when there is that openness, I find they show up. When there is resistance, which is natural because it's scary to talk to people who we may not be able to see, right? Or we don't know everything about, right? It's this whole process that the mind doesn't really love to do, but the intuition definitely does, right? So I get it's scary, but I find that when there's this, I'm open to being supported by healthy and well ancestors, all of a sudden they show up. And then finally, what I'll name is that, and I write about this in Finding Refuge, reciprocity is important. I make offerings to my ancestors. I just did a ritual yesterday, and I pour out libations for my ancestors. So I poured out libations. Often I do it at an oak tree in my backyard, but I did it in a bowl because I was online leading something. And so I'm offering libations to them, right, that are then evaporated and uplifted to the ancestral realm. I will, someone gave me a piece of pound cake recently, and I started to eat it, and I realized it wasn't for me. It was for my grandmother. She made the best pound cake. So I put it on my ancestor altar, right, energetically as an offering for her. I tend my ancestor altar as well and have things from different ancestors there transition. So reciprocity feels important. And again, this can be I'm talking about my grandmother a lot because she's so influential and inspirational. But again, this can be teachers, teachings, right? Make the offering an offering to a song that has inspired you and moved you. Maybe you sing, right? Maybe you write a love letter to it, or a piece of art, or offer something energetically or physically. It depends on how you want to work with this, to a teacher who's inspired you. Like, there are all of these ways to work with ancestors. And I feel this is one of the ways we can feel less alone, is to invite our healthy and well ancestors to support us.
I think a lot of people do that also in prayer, as you were talking about, when we talk about the unseen. And many people, including myself, we get the sense when a loved one that has passed is near us. And that's something that's becoming more of a common practice of people feeling that.
It is. And more people asking about ancestors. And I think you're absolutely right that in prayer, right, we're asking for something, we're offering something, we're acknowledging something through prayer, we're being reverent, right, through prayer. And that's an opening, right, for our healthy and well guides and ancestors to remind us they are present with us, because I actually believe they are present most of the time. And we have some agency around, how we work with them and how we invite them in.
I really love the chapter that talked about your adventure with bees. And what were some of the maybe like a lesson that really has stuck with you about your adventure with bees?
Oh, how I love the honeybees. I was just out feeding them before our conversation because it's a dearth time, meaning there isn't as much blooming that has nectar. August is a dearth in North Carolina, and so I'm feeding them so they can prepare to have enough food throughout the winter. And chapter 6 is all about the honeybees and the hive mind. And the lesson I will share is that I have learned more about what it means to be in community with one another and all beings from watching the honeybees. And I have learned about the hive mind and the reality that bees do not think of themselves as individual bees, but instead an extension of the hive, from watching how they relate to one another, how they move together, the vibration, the sound, and how that changes in their hive, how they care for the hive, how they birth, right? How they prepare a cell of honeycomb for the queen to lay the egg, and then how the nurse bees keep the baby bees, which are the brood, warm until they hatch. And of course, I've seen a baby bee hatch, come out of their cell and clean their cell. And then all of a sudden they become a nurse bee. So they continue this pattern of care. So the lesson I've learned is about community and what it means to understand we are an extension of each other and that which is bigger than us. Bees, of course, are a superorganism. Ants are a superorganism in the same way, right? So it's not an individual experience they're having. Everything is in service of the hive. And this is the I think biggest lesson I've learned. And of course, in this chapter, I also talk about grief and loss because it is about losing a hive and at the same time, another hive thriving and the hive I lost, leaving an entire box of honey for us that we had to process. So it's also about this other lesson, the sweetness that can coexist alongside the grief or loss or darkness we might, however people want to frame that. I have learned so much from the honeybees and of course about honeybees and had many adventures with the honeybees. Chapter 6 in Finding Refuge is all about them. And there are two lessons I'll share. And one is about the hive mind and what I've learned about community from watching them and just being in relationship with them in a different way because I have hives on my land. Bees are superorganisms, so they do not think of themselves as individuals, a single bee. The bees think about themselves as an extension of the hive. And I think this is beautiful. And there's something in this idea of being a superorganism and the practice of not seeing oneself as separate that we could learn from as humans, right? And it feels connected to our place in the ecosystem, our relationship to all beings, our relationship to the honeybees, and the fact that we rely on them for fresh food and many other things, I will say, tangible and sort of energetic as well. And, I've learned about community from being in their hives, from watching them, from listening to their hum, which if folks listening are not allergic to bees and have had an opportunity or have an opportunity to listen to the hum sitting next to it or putting your ear up to the hive, there's nothing else like it. The vibration, right? The aliveness of a hive. And so chapter 6 is hive mind, and it is an invitation for us and for readers to think about what does it mean to be part of a hive and to hold that collective consciousness, right? And to do everything in service of the hive, right? The collective in this case. So that's one lesson. And the other lesson, there are many, but I'll speak to. I wrote about losing a hive and over wintertime, and then a hive thriving. I had two hives at the time. I lost one, and then the other one swarmed. And this juxtaposition of like, oh, there's death and transition happening, and then this other hive like built comb all over the top of their box where I'd had food for them, and they had eaten that, and they'd started to build because they needed more space. And it was really interesting to be with that contrast of life, right, and growth and expansion and death. And the other piece of this is that the hive who transitioned, they left us a box of honey that we had to process, and we didn't have any things to process it with because we weren't planning on taking honey or harvesting it. And we ended up, in the wake of my seeing this hive no longer alive in the same way, having to work with their medicine, right? Their gift, their honey. And the lesson I learned from that feels connected to the contrast of death and expansion, in that this lesson was about how sweetness can coexist and be alongside loss and death and transition. And how often, if I think about my own life, I've been moving through a process of grief and loss and responding to it, and also sweetness has been present either through the experience of grief and loss or just alongside it. And so there is more. I could talk about the honeybees all day. And those are two lessons I'll uplift: the hive mind and the multiple experiences we can have, and the sweetness and the loss at the same time.
Well, I just loved that chapter. There was so much to it. And your book just has so many gems of information for people. Michelle, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me on the show. People can find me in many ways, but my website is the best way, michellecjohnson.com. It's updated all the time with different events, retreats, immersions, online and in-person offerings. And I have, people can subscribe to my newsletter. That is a bi-monthly newsletter, which includes my events, but also musings and what's moving through for me and what's on my mind and in my heart. And I'm also on social media at Skill in Action on Instagram is a good way to see what I'm up to and what I'm photographing and what I'm thinking about. So those are two ways that people can stay in community with me. So yeah.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be here.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It has been such an honor to have you here and to talk about your new book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. Finding Refuge is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And remember, support our indie bookstores. If you don't see the book on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. You can also purchase this book directly from the publisher, Shambhala, at shambhala.com. Make sure to visit Michelle's website at michellecjohnson.com. She has several amazing workshops coming up, so make sure to sign up for her newsletter and be part of her community. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Today we celebrate a milestone, 1,000 Moments with Marianne radio show episodes, all available for free at mariannepastana.com. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.